and welcome to Conversations with Matt Delacry. We now begin our look at the hymn in detail. Because hymns are very dense theological statements, we can do this. Every single word and phrase has a lot of meaning. First up, we have a statement about Christ saying that he is the image of the invisible God. So let's start at the beginning. What's an image? Images in the ancient world were generally representations of people and gods. Think of a picture, only they didn't have pictures back then. So images were generally things that were painted, sculpted, or placed on coins. However, images were not really supposed to be pictures. They were more like portraits. Think about a portrait an artist painted hundreds of years ago. Portraits like these did show you what a person looked like, but more than that, they were meant to communicate something about that person. They were meant to tell you a little bit about who the subject was. Likewise, images were supposed to communicate something about whoever they were representing. An image of a Roman emperor on a coin, for example, did show you a bit about what he looked like, but more than that, it showed you what was unique about him, either through the portrayal of the man or something he was associated with. For example, a coin might have a picture of a cornucopia on it, like those little things that you see at Thanksgiving that have fruit and bread and other things coming out of them. This would indicate that whoever is on the coin would bring abundance, fertility, happiness, etc. To hungry people and to those responsible for growing food, this would be a welcome message. As another example, the Emperor Commodus minted coins with him on it wearing a lion skin. Since the lion skin was the usual depiction of Hercules, he was trying to communicate that he was the incarnation of Hercules. You see, images did communicate what a person looked like, but primarily they were about the communication of ideas. Something else under the umbrella of images is an idol. Idols were another form of image. Think of an idol as a particular form of an image. Image is a general category, and idol is a specific kind of image. As an image, idols were not meant to capture the physical features of God. They were meant to tell you something about that deity. An idol would, therefore, be a representation of a god. Again, it would not actually describe what a god looked like. After all, who had seen the god? Generally no one, though sometimes gods, especially the Greek ones, would come in human form. Idols are meant to communicate something about that god. Sometimes they would do this by showing something that represented that god. Think Zeus and his lightning bolt, Poseidon and his trident, that three-pointed thingy that speared fish, Apollo and the sun, Hermes and his winged sandals. You get the picture. Now think about the fact that in the Old Testament, Jews were told not to make any images of God. Don't try to represent God, because you can't. However, in Colossians, we're told that Christ actually is the image of God. God said, don't make any images, because you'll get it wrong. However, I'm giving you an image. If you want to know what I'm like, look at Christ. This is a claim that Christianity is making. It's making the claim that Christ is the representation of God. Again, this does not say anything about what God actually looks like. God is spirit. He doesn't have a physical body. So God could not look anything like a first century Middle Eastern Jewish man. What Christ as the image is saying is if you want to know what God is like, what his character is like, who he is, then you should look at Christ. However, there is actually more to Christ being the image than just knowing what God's character is like, though that's quite a lot. Because Christ actually is a person and not a statue or a face on a coin, he is something more than just a representation of God. He is also the representative. Because he could interact with the people around him, he could actually stand in the place of God and act on God's behalf. And many times in the Gospels, you see him doing just that. Think about the times that Christ forgave someone's sins. God's job. Or about the times he passed judgment on someone, especially the religious leaders. Also God's job. Because Christ was and is the living image of God, he is God's representative to us. He stands and acts in God's place. So we've talked about what an image is. Now we need to move on to the next part of this phrase. Christ is the image of the invisible God. we need to talk about what the invisible God means. The phrase, the invisible God, indicates transcendence. We're talking about the God who cannot be seen. Christ, however, as the image, can be seen. Christ is how the invisible becomes visible and moves into the realm of human sense perception. It's saying that God has revealed himself by coming into the world as a man that could be seen and touched. But there is still more to this than just that. This phrase points to a much bigger discussion that had been going on for a long time, and one to which Christians had a unique answer. The issue was transcendence versus immanence. Now, transcendence is basically the idea that God was up there. He's so far above everything that no human could possibly reach up to him. Immanence is the idea that God can interact with us. He can be near us, and he can do things like answer our prayers. Obviously, these two things seem a bit contradictory. If God is so far above us that he can't come down here, then how can he come down here? Well, there are a few ways that Jewish thinkers use to try to bridge the gap. First up is wisdom, or more specifically, the wisdom of God. If you read the first chapters of Proverbs, you see this figure called wisdom. Wisdom is spoken of as a person, more specifically as a woman. God's wisdom was thought of as almost a personification of God and a way in which God could interact with humans while still being up there. Wisdom was the wise way in which God created the world and allows him to interact with the world. You see, Proverbs actually gives wisdom credit for the creation of the world. I'm going to read to you two verses from Proverbs. It can be chapter 8, verses 22 and 30, which say, "The Lord possessed me," speaking of wisdom, "at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old." Skipping to verse 30, "Then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always." Wisdom, according to Proverbs, existed before creation but came from God. Wisdom was also responsible, at some level, for creation. What's interesting is that in verse 16 of the hymn, we will see Christ given credit for creation. However, wisdom is not exactly identified with Christ. The author of the hymn uses wisdom as a sort of springboard to make statements about Christ. He says creation was made for Christ. Nothing like that was ever said about wisdom, either inside the Old Testament or outside of it. This was not part of wisdom thought. This was Christians taking the Jewish ideas about wisdom and then using them to explain Christ. They were saying, Christ is sort of like wisdom, but more. Christians are entering into the discussion about God's transcendence and immanence and suggesting that Christ solves that dilemma. This allowed early Christians to explain Christ's relationship to the Father in ways other than simply an obedient man chosen by God for a special task, sort of like a prophet or king. Wisdom opened a new category for them. But sometimes they surpassed wisdom thought as they were trying to find ways to express what they perceived as reality. Now, the next major way in which Jewish thinkers tried to solve the transcendence immanence dilemma was with logos. Logos, or as it's more commonly said, logos, is a divine reason or God's plan for the universe. You're probably already familiar with logos, even if you don't know it. I can almost guarantee you know one verse that talks about it, John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek word for word is logos. John 1:1 actually reads more like, "In the beginning was a logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God." You see, for as much as everybody makes about it today, this verse is actually not controversial at all, or at least it wasn't in Jesus' day. It's only talking about the reason of God. God's reason was with him in the beginning, and was God too. Jewish thinkers would have been readily familiar with this. No problem. The real problem with John 1 is in verse 14, when it says, "And the Word," logos, "became flesh and dwelt among us." The reason of God existing in the beginning with God and being God? No problem. The reason of God becoming a human being? Blasphemy. The real scandal of John 1 isn't verse 1. It's verse 14. Now, the term logos is never used in Colossians, though some of the ideas are similar. What I'm doing is trying to give you a bit of a background for how people thought about God and how he could interact with humanity. Wisdom and logos are two ways that are a little more relevant to Colossians, but there are other examples that you've probably heard of as well. For example, there's the Spirit of God, which is the dynamic vitality of God's presence, sort of the way we can feel God's presence. And there's the glory of God. In other words, what human eyes can see of God. These were ways that Jewish thinkers used to speak of God and his interaction with humanity. And again, we're talking Jewish thinkers. Christians sometimes mean things a little different. But these terms, spirit, glory, wisdom, logos, and image, were not meant to refer to something other than God. They meant God and his presence with humans, God and how humans can perceive him, God in his wisdom, and so on and so forth. They were ways of showing how a transcendent God could also be immanent, how a God up there could also interact with us down here. Wisdom and image are really the only ones we see in Colossians. Image is in the foreground, and wisdom forms sort of the background, but there are others that you should know about as well. Now, where this whole image thing gets interesting is when we consider that it's not just Christ who is in the image of God. Genesis 1 says that humans were made in the image of God. However, while both Christ and man are in the image of God, they're images in different ways. Man is more of the bottom-up image, while Christ is more of the top-down image. Man was created in the image of God. Christ, however, is the eternal wisdom of God sent to earth as God's image. And that is a very different way of being the image of God. What we need to understand is that believers, like Christ, are to represent God. We were made in the image of God, and we are never more human than when we reflect our Creator. Humans were meant to reflect their Creator. We are currently broken, but we are being fixed so that we will represent our Creator again. Colossians 3:10 tells us that believers are being renewed in the image of their Creator. The end goal is for humans to reflect their Creator in the same way that Christ reflects God, though in a lesser way. This is something that we should be doing during this life, and it is something we should be improving at continually. Later on in the letter, Paul will explain how to do this. Now, there's something else we should think about. If Christ really is the image of the invisible God, then he's the one who represents God completely. Christ is a place where man can see God clearly. Remember, he is the image of the invisible God. He is the way that we can see the God who cannot be seen. Now, there are other ways that we can see part of God. I think we can see some of God in creation. We can know something about the Creator from his work. And it would not be surprising that if humans tried to understand God as best as they could from creation, they would get at least some things right. So I think we can understand a little bit about God from humanity's attempts to reach up to God, and by that I mean other religions. However, the only place where we can see God fully is in Christ. Other religions may get some things right, but they also get things wrong. Christ is God's way of revealing himself to humanity. It's not man reaching up to God, it's God reaching down to man. So if God has actually reached down to man and we want to know God, then we need to ask the question, why would we look anywhere else? Why would we expect to find out more about God through some other means than the way God chose to reveal himself to humanity? Wouldn't God know best how to reach us?